growing up, I felt, so much of the pain, but also the beauty of the stutter for me was the way it feels like it alters time in a certain way.
I'm Maya and I'm a woman who stutters.
And I'm Cynthia Chin, Maya's longtime friend, and I know nothing about stuttering.
And this is Proud Stutter, a podcast about stuttering and embracing verbal diversity in an effort to change how we talk about it, one conversation at a time. Welcome back to Proud Stutter. I am so excited to be talking today to the one and only Jerome Ellis. Jerome is a Black stuttering animal who practices performance, music, and poetry. He is also a person who stutters. Jerome recently released an album titled The Clearing. The Guardian describes his album as a profound and richly textured 12-track album that blends spoken word and storytelling with ambient jazz and experimental electronics to create a soundscape that is both meditative and theatrical. Jerome, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Maya, so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here with you.
So, Jerome, I absolutely loved your album. It was truly one of the most beautiful pieces of music and poetry I've ever listened to. And I sincerely mean that because, I've never really connected so much to music before. Like I've grown up listening to music, but I don't know. It's just never really spoke to me in as an emotional way as yours did. And I think it's because it was really an entirely new experience for me. It was beyond emotion. It was transcendent, which I know is a word that's used through intermittently in the album. So before we get to your album, I wanted to ask some questions about your stutter specifically. And the first one is, when did you first notice you had a stutter, and what was it like growing up?
Oh, thank you, Maya, so much. Thank you for your kind words. It really means so much to hear. I think I noticed it probably in elementary school sometime. It was interesting because I was in this theatrical improvisation problem solving troupe called Odyssey of the Mind. It was a group of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 students, and we would be on stage and we would compete with other schools in these like improvisation challenges. So I'd be on stage and I really loved doing it. But I remember then when I went into middle school around the age of 12 that I was thinking, oh, I would love to be an actor because I love to be on stage so much. And then I thought, oh, but wait, I have a stutter. And so that's not going to work. Like I'm not allowed to be an actor. I didn't know about, James Earl Jones, Marilyn Monroe, and these other actors with stutters. So, so around elementary school is when I learned that I had one, which I found really interesting because I wonder, how my approach was before I learned that I had stutter. Part of what I'm trying to do with the clearing is actually with the work is to try to undo some of the things that has been told to me about stuttering, that it's, a pathology.
Can you tell us more about what it was like growing up with a stutter?
Yeah, growing up, it was, I definitely felt weird a lot of the time, and that I didn't have the language to even express how weird, the ways in which I felt weird or that I stood out. I think gradually I started to notice that my stutter would appear more frequently with certain kinds of people. Like I would notice that I would stutter less frequently with people whose gender expression seemed to be more female than people whose gender expression seemed to be more male. I would stutter very little with children, with other children, and with animals. Would stutter more with adults. Um, so gradually, and I started to observe these things about this very mysterious, creature living inside me. One that I have come to love so much. But for many years, I regarded my stutter as like a curse, something I wanted to get rid of.
We've interviewed, I think, about 5 or 6 guests now, and I think you're the first person who's brought up how your stuttering changes depending on who you're talking to. And I love that you brought up animals, because you call yourself an animal as well. And, I don't even think about talking to animals in that kind of way. Why do you think it is that talking to animals specifically, you don't have a stutter?
Well, I think part of the experience was a fear of being judged, or a fear of being thought that I was weird, a fear that I would be interrupted, a fear that someone would think I was stupid. And these are fears that I just don't feel when I talk to animals. Like, I'll go to the zoo and just like talk to the animals. I love to talk to animals. And I was so afraid, in school, of just people making fun of me or thinking I'm, weird again or stupid. But these animals, I would just talk to the birds. And my grandma had a bunch of birds in Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, New York, in her apartment. And I'd love to be with those birds. And yeah, I've just felt very, very safe from the fears of all the pressures surrounding speech with humans, all the performance involved in it, in school, I would sometimes raise my hand and then be called on, and I knew the answer, but I would stutter so much that sometimes I couldn't even say the answer. And then I would think like, oh, does the teacher think that I'm not as smart as I am?
You know how they suggest for people with stage fright to imagine everyone naked? Do you imagine everyone as animals?
I love that. I love that. I've never actually, I don't know. I don't think I've ever tried that before. I really love that as an idea. It's so much of the pain that I experienced growing up with stuttering is that it felt like a barrier to connecting with people, and now I don't feel like that so much. Now I often find stuttering becomes the bridge that can connect me with people, including with you two. We might not be talking if it weren't for the stutters. I'm very grateful for that. So I love that idea of imagining the audience as animals. And stage fright is so interesting because what I found very gradually, as a performer, as an adult, is that the stage actually for me also became another kind of safe space for my stutter, because even though, like many people, I at first would feel a lot of stage fright, what I've gradually learned is that most audiences that I've been in front of, at least, they're very respectful of the stutter in a way that some people in the street, in daily life, might not be. So many of my experiences performing on stage, I feel that the audience will just wait as long as they want, because that's part of what being an audience member is to listen.
I was the same way. Growing up, I always wanted to be on stage, and I loved performing. It was where I felt most alive, and my stuttering did hold me back a lot in trying out for, those acting gigs at school. That's why doing a podcast resonated so much with me, because it is kind of like I'm performing, and it fills the space in my heart that I've been wanting it to fill for such a long time.
I'm so glad to hear that you have this space, Maya. That's really very important. I'm so glad you find that. It can be so painful when we have the need to create, but we don't have the outlet for it.
Yeah. And I always thought like I wasn't creative and all these things. And I just never really gave myself the opportunity to create. And so it's the best feeling in the world. And I'm just so thankful to be able to have this platform to connect and be creative. When did you first think of how you could connect your stutter to music? And have you always been into music?
Yeah, I think it's only been, very recently, around 2015 or so. My friend James Harrison Monaco, who he and I have been collaborating for some years now, since about 2008. We create live performance and theater together. And we were working on this piece called Ink, a piece for museums. And it's like an art lecture and concert at the same time. So we use like a slideshow style art lecture images with live music that we created. And it was the first in that show, and it's also like at the same time a personal essay. And in that show, which we premiered at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, for whom we like really made the piece, that piece was the first time that I spoke about stuttering on stage, spoke about it directly, and since then I've spoken more and more about it directly, and woven it more and more into my work. As I became a musician, I also noticed that music is a way that we can alter time, So I grew up around a lot of West Indian music, and the first music that I really came to on my own was European classical music, a lot of Mozart and Beethoven, and then jazz. And it was when I started playing the saxophone, was when I was really listening to a lot of jazz, around the age of 13. And in being surrounded by these different kinds of music, and jazz particularly with its deep practices of improvisation, and also jazz, jazz's history with jazz as a black music, really, I really resonated with it as someone black, as someone interested in black history, as someone also who is very used to improvising, as many stutterers are, through the use of synonyms or finding other ways to say things. So, I think there was an early connection between jazz's improvisation and stuttering's improvisation that, it only took me, it took me some years to be able to really think about that. But I think when I started playing the piano, also around the age of 15, I started to be able to create these like sonic worlds, and these sonic worlds that felt like, refuges in time, and I feel like I would go to the piano so much to heal myself from the temporal pain that I would feel during the day, with so much of it connected with stuttering, that I would have an encounter at school. Yeah, like I said, with like raising my hand and the teacher would call me and I couldn't say the answer. And that was painful. And part of the pain had to do with, time, that, I didn't say the answer in the right amount of time. And I feel like so much of my piano practice became like, I would go to the piano and just like, try to heal from the wounds that I had experienced. And with poetry, something also there's a kind of liberation that I feel in poetry, that stuttering, of course, so much of the pain that I have experienced in connection with stuttering, I don't think stuttering is the cause. I think it's in connection with stuttering and certain ableist, expectations in the world. But so much of the pain, I think, also comes from, it comes from time, but also comes from language. That I've had many years of this experience of like language I'm at odds with language, that I know what I need to say, but I can't say it in the time that I want to say it. And with poetry, it feels like there's so much freedom that I get to explore with language, and I get to escape also the like utilitarian or bureaucratic uses of language that's so much of the day to day. So poetry as music as a space of liberation, poetry as a space of liberation, and healing.
I listened to your album last night as well, and I thought it was amazing. And one thing that I really, really felt from your album is this sort of meditative quality. I mean, of course, in the music, but also just in the way that you speak. And I remember distinctly, I mean, this is all kind of, I think, relevant because of everything that you're saying about it being healing. I think the way that you portrayed your interactions, instead of what I see a lot when it comes to the stuttering narrative, this one track that you had, I remember it very clearly. It was a recording of you asking for a specific book on the phone. You first told her and disclosed to her that you had a stutter and that it may take some time for your words to get out. And for some reason, I could feel on the other side of the line that she was just like, okay, and was patiently waiting. I could have, for some reason, I didn't imagine her kind of like, clicking her fingers. I just felt like the whole thing was really, really healing for me too, to hear an interaction like that and to see so much positivity and to see everything between the lines too, from that short interaction.
Oh, Cynthia, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really so meaningful to hear. I'm so glad. Yeah, that's so the goal is to offer healing. So hopefully the album is able to contribute a little bit to that. I think it's important to include both the bookseller part 1 and part 2, that both are, I think, valid approaches, because what I'm not saying, of course, is that the stutterer should always disclose the stutter. I don't think it's so simple as, these rules, like you should always do this, or, I think the first part where I don't tell them that I have a stutter that I'm hung up on, that is important too. And that it's not, I think I try to think of communication as, and there's a scholar named Joshua St. Pierre who also is a person who stutters, is a disability studies scholar, and he writes about communication as a shared responsibility. I have a responsibility to steward the conversation and to be caring in the conversation, and the other person does as well. And to me, it is an act, like it is one option for me to disclose that I speak with a stutter, but to me that is not. It is not an outright requirement, because to me, the other person also, they're responsible for, for I think, holding space for a wide range of communicative possibilities. That there are people who are going to get on the phone who need more time, whether they have a stutter or or they speak they speak in another way that is not as that is marginalized.
So I wanted to talk about track 1 and track 2. Track 1 is called Loops in Retreat, and track 2, I don't want to butcher this, so Jerome, can you say track 2 for us?
Oh yes, sure. Yes, it's Jede Krankheit ist ein musikalisches Problem.
Oh yeah, I'm glad we didn't try that.
Lovely. Yeah, so in tracks 1 and 2, you talk about the connection between Black history and disfluency. Throughout this album and in these 2 clips, you are intersecting Blackness, fluency, and music. Can you talk more about this connection and why it was so important to you to bring in your album?
I think I was interested in speaking from, my my identity, my positionality, my political, positionality as, a Black person and a disfluent person. And, as a Black person who stutters, who is a musician, I wanted to speak about these three things, these three dimensions, of life that I, have lived in for some time. And I wanted to think about them through time, through the lens of time, because in recent years I had come across, through my friend and great artist Jalen Livingston, introduced me to the scholar Brittany Cooper's TED Talk, The Racial Politics of Time, where she's talking about blackness and time. And music and time I've been thinking about for a long time, about music's relationship to time, the way it shapes and bends and alters and organizes time. And then I had been recently thinking about stuttering in time, largely also through the writings of Joshua St. Pierre. Because Joshua St. Pierre, he writes about how certain disabilities, like if someone uses a wheelchair, that some of the ways that the environment can be disabling is through space, through not having curb cuts and elevators and ramps, that the person in the wheelchair has to navigate is at a spatial, is marginalized spatially. And St. Pierre talks about stuttering then in terms of as disability, as a marginalization that takes place in time, that the person who stutters is often excluded from certain rhythms and expectations of time, and that can lead to discrimination, in job interviews, things like that, and so I was thinking about music and time, blackness and time, stuttering and time. So I was like, well, how about we try to think about all four of these things together? And the opening line of the album is, Lucid Retreat is, my thesis is that blackness, disfluency, and music are forces that open time. And by opening, I wanted to speak to the way that time is not allowed to be only linear when seen from the vantage point of blackness, disfluency in music. With blackness, Professor Cooper talks about in the TED Talk, Racial Politics of Time. She quotes Hegel, who says essentially that Africa has no influence on world history, and that Africans are not historical beings. And so there's this attempt by this white European philosopher to exclude Africans from time, and she talks about, black state-sanctioned Black Death as also a loss of time. And then, and stuttering, as we've been talking about, has all these interesting relationships to it. So I wanted to try to think of them together, to think with Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of the intersection.
And that's it for this episode. I'm Maya.
And I'm Cynthia.
And you've been listening to Proud Stutter. This episode of Proud Stutter was produced by me, Maya Chupkov.
And edited by me, Cynthia Chen. Our music was composed by Augusto Denise, and our artwork by Mara Ezekiel and Noah Chupkov.
If you have an idea or want to be part of future episodes, find us on Twitter @ProudStutter. You can also find us at www.proudstutter.com.
Drop us a note or share a voice memo. What's your stuttering story? What topics would you like us to cover? And what are you curious about?
And if you like the show, you can leave us a review wherever you are listening to this podcast.
More importantly, tell your friends to listen too.
Until we meet again, thanks for listening. Be proud and be you.